The letter arrived soaked in salt water, the ink bleeding at its edges like a wound that refused to close, and Alma Merriweather read it 3 times before she understood that everything she had known was gone. She stood at the stern of the steamship Elspeth as the coast of England disappeared into the gray morning fog, the letter pressed flat against her chest, the cold Atlantic air pulling at the dark ribbon tied around her bonnet. She was 24 years old, and she owned one trunk, one carpet bag, one pair of decent leather boots, and a letter of employment from a schoolteachers' cooperative in a town called Harlan Creek, Colorado Territory. The letter had been arranged through a church organization in Liverpool, and the wages were modest, but the promise was clear. There was a schoolhouse waiting, and 32 children who had never been properly taught their letters. That was enough. It had to be enough. The crossing took 22 days. She did not weep during the first week, when the ship rolled hard on swells that sent half the passengers below with sickness. She did not weep during the second week, when a woman 2 bunks over in the lower deck quarters lost a baby she had been carrying, and the small sound of that grief passed through the wooden walls like smoke. She held the woman's hand and made her tea from the small reserve she had brought wrapped in cloth, and she told her that morning always came whether you asked for it or not. She believed it, or she made herself believe it, because the alternative was to stop believing entirely, and the sea was very deep and the shore was very far. She wept once, on the 19th day, standing alone at the rail in a light drizzle, looking at nothing but open water. She wept for her mother, who had died of consumption 2 winters ago. She wept for her father, who had followed 3 months later, less from illness than from the particular kind of quiet grief that had no name in any language she knew. She wept for the small terraced house in Merseyside where she had learned to read by firelight, and had believed for years that a quiet and ordinary life was something a person could simply choose. Then she dried her face with her sleeve, watched a gannet dive like a thrown knife into the water below, and resolved that she would not weep again until she had at least set foot on American soil and given the New World a fair chance to earn her tears. New York was enormous and terrifying and smelled of horse and bread and coal smoke all at once. She crossed it by cab, following written directions she had been given, found the rail terminus, and bought her ticket west with money she had saved for 14 months. The train took 5 days, stopping at cities whose names she spoke aloud to herself like small prayers: Chicago, Kansas City, Pueblo. At each stop she watched through the window as the landscape changed, the tall brick buildings giving way to prairie grass, the grass giving way to something wider and more bare than she had words for. When the Rocky Mountains finally rose on the horizon, she pressed her nose against the glass like a child and felt, for the first time in a very long while, something that was not quite hope, but was perhaps the ground beneath which hope might eventually grow. Harlan Creek was a day's ride south of Pueblo by stagecoach. It had one main street, a livery stable, a dry goods store, a church with a lopsided steeple, a saloon that made no pretense of being anything other than what it was, a doctor's office, and a schoolhouse at the end of a dirt path that ran along the creek for which the town had been named. The stagecoach driver, a broad man named Orrin who chewed tobacco with quiet dedication and smelled of leather and pine resin, pointed it all out to her as they came down the last slope into town. "You the new school teacher?" he asked. "I am," she said. "From England. Liverpool. Long way." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He helped her down from the coach and handed her trunk to her with a kind of solemn efficiency, and she stood in the middle of the street of Harlan Creek, Colorado Territory in the year 1878, with the afternoon sun cutting long gold shadows across the dust, and she thought, well, here it is. Here is the new life. She was given a room in the boarding house owned by a woman named Mrs. Claudette Ives, who was 60 years old and moved like a woman of 45 and spoke like a woman who had heard everything and forgot nothing. The room was small and clean and had a window that faced east, so the morning light came in first thing, and Alma decided on the spot that this was a good omen or close enough to one. The school began on a Monday. 34 children showed up, which was 2 more than advertised, and they ranged in age from 5 to 13, and came from every kind of family the territory had to offer: miners' children, ranchers' children, the 3 daughters of the Chinese man who ran the laundry, 2 boys whose mother was Ute, and whose father was a trapper who had long since gone further west. She looked out at all of them on that first morning and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with some surprise, as purpose. She taught them reading and arithmetic and geography. She taught them with the kind of patience that had been bred in her partly by disposition and partly by hard circumstance, and the children responded to it, the way dry ground responds to rain, not all at once, not with drama, but with a slow and certain opening. By the end of the first month, she had 3 of the older boys reading full sentences, and by the end of the second month she had the 5-year-old girl named Elspeth, the same name as the ship, reciting the alphabet from memory in a voice like a small bell. She was, by every measure she could apply, doing what she had come to do. The new life was taking shape around her, awkwardly and imperfectly, and with the particular character of things built in untamed places, but it was taking shape. She had not expected anything else. She had not expected Clarence Abbott. He came into town on a Thursday in late October, which was 6 weeks after Alma arrived, on a horse the color of red clay with a white blaze on its forehead that made it look, depending on the angle, either noble or slightly startled. He came from the north, which was the direction the wind also came from that day, and both the man and the wind arrived with the kind of purpose that made people stop and look. She saw him from the window of the schoolhouse, where she was erasing the arithmetic problems from the board after the children had gone home for the afternoon. She did not think much of it at first. Men rode into Harlan Creek regularly. It was a stop on 2 different freight routes and a reasonable distance from the mining camps to the north, and men on horses were simply part of the scenery. But then she looked again, because there was something in the way he sat the horse that was not the ordinary traveling posture of a man going somewhere. He rode with the specific looseness of a man who had been in the saddle for days, or possibly weeks, and who had stopped caring about destinations some time back. He was lean and dark-haired and wore a long canvas coat that had seen considerable weather, and when he stopped his horse in front of the saloon and looked up at the sky before he dismounted, the expression on his face was the one she had worn on the 19th day of the crossing, the face of a person who has agreed to keep going but has not yet agreed to feel anything about it. She looked away and finished erasing the board and told herself it was none of her business. She was wrong about that, as she would later tell him, and he would laugh in that low, reluctant way he had, which always sounded to her like a man who had forgotten he knew how. His name she learned the next morning, because Harlan Creek was a town of approximately 400 people and information traveled in it the way water travels in a shallow pan, quickly, and in all directions simultaneously. Mrs. Ives told her over breakfast that the man who had arrived the night before was named Clarence Abbott, that he was from Missouri, that he had once had a wife and a small farm on the eastern edge of the Ozarks, and that both had been taken from him in circumstances that Mrs. Ives described as the kind of thing that makes a man ride away and not look back. Alma poured her tea and did not ask for more details, because she understood that kind of thing without needing the specifics. Some griefs were different in their particulars and the same in their architecture. "He is taking a job at the Rafferty cattle operation," Mrs. Ives added, spreading butter across her bread with careful attention. "Bill Rafferty has been looking for another hand since the Dixon boy left for Denver in the spring." "That seems sensible," Alma said. "He is quiet," Mrs. Ives said, which in her vocabulary was the highest possible compliment. "I served him a plate last night when he asked if I had anything left from supper. He said thank you 3 times and apologized for the inconvenience." Alma said nothing to that, but she thought about the face she had seen from the schoolhouse window, and she thought that 3 thank yous and an apology sounded like a man who was carrying something large, and had learned to set it down very carefully so as not to knock anything over. She met him properly 2 days later, which was a Saturday, when most of the town gathered at the dry goods store in the late morning because the freight wagon had come in from Pueblo, and there were new supplies, which in a place like Harlan Creek was an event worthy of attendance. Alma was there to buy lamp oil and a new pencil box for the schoolhouse, and Clarence Abbott was there because he needed a new pair of work gloves, the pair he had ridden in with having given up somewhere in Wyoming. They reached for different things on adjacent shelves, and she nearly knocked a tin of tobacco off the edge of the shelf nearest her elbow, and he caught it before it fell. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. There was a brief pause in which both of them became aware that they were standing quite close together in a narrow aisle, and Alma stepped back slightly and looked at him directly, which she always did and which sometimes startled people who expected her to look away. He did not look startled. He looked, if anything, as though he had braced for something and found it milder than expected. He was 30 years old, which she would learn later. He had eyes the color of creek water over brown stones, greenish, shifting, neither one thing nor the other. He had a jaw that looked like it had been designed to hold a great deal back, and a scar along his left hand that she would eventually come to know the story of, but not yet. "You are the school teacher," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," she said, "Alma Merriweather, Clarence Abbott." He did not offer his hand, which she noted. He held it slightly at his side as though the gesture was one he had put away for safe keeping. "From the boarding house," he said. "Mrs. Ives mentioned you." "She mentioned you as well." Something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the vicinity of one. "I can only imagine what she said." "She said you were quiet," Alma told him. She meant it kindly. This time it was a smile or the beginning of one, and it changed his face in a way she was not prepared for, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it looked like something that had cost him something to produce, and therefore meant more than a smile ought to mean. "I imagine she intended it that way," he said. "It is good to meet you, Miss Merriweather. And you, Mr. Abbott." They went their separate ways in the store, and she bought her lamp oil and her pencil box, and he bought his gloves, and nothing else of particular note happened that Saturday. But she found herself walking back along the main street with her purchases wrapped in brown paper under her arm, thinking about that smile and the cost of it, and she made herself stop thinking about it on the grounds that she had come to Harlan Creek to build a life, not to complicate one. She had not accounted for the way a quiet man's presence could be a kind of complication all on its own. The weeks that followed had the quality of a song that is played very softly in an adjacent room. You are not quite sure you hear it, but you find yourself listening. Clarence Abbott worked out at the Rafferty spread during the week, which was 3 miles south of town along a road that paralleled the creek, and he came into town on Saturdays for supplies. And on Sunday mornings he attended the church service, which Alma also attended because she had found it one of the few places in Harlan Creek where the quiet was structured and therefore restful. They sat in different pews and did not speak during the service, but she became aware of him the way you become aware of weather, not through any single dramatic sign, but through the accumulation of small signals. The way he held his hat in both hands during the hymns. The way he looked at the stained glass window above the altar with an expression that was not devotion exactly, but was something adjacent to it. A kind of respectful attention paid to things too large to understand. She spoke to him after service twice in November, brief exchanges about the weather, which had turned sharp and cold and come down off the mountains in long gray curtains. The second time, she mentioned that she was having difficulty getting the schoolhouse stove to draw properly, and that the children were arriving in the mornings with red hands from the cold. He came by the following Tuesday afternoon, after the children had gone, and looked at the stove with the quiet, efficient attention of a man who had fixed enough things that fixing was simply a habit of mind. He adjusted the flue and cleaned the pipe where a bird had built a partial nest that was blocking the draw, and he got the fire going before she had finished making the pot of tea she had started when she saw him coming up the path. She brought 2 cups out, and he accepted one with that same careful thank you she had heard about from Mrs. Ives, and they stood by the stove in the warmth the fixed thing was now producing and talked, for the first time, really talked, for approximately 45 minutes, and somewhere in that 45 minutes she understood that she was in some difficulty. He had come from Rolla, Missouri, he told her. He had grown up farming, had inherited his father's land at 22, had married a woman named Sarah at 24. Sarah had been good and kind, and had laughed at things that deserved to be laughed at, and had made the small house in the Ozarks into a home through some alchemy that was simply her particular nature. She had died in the spring of 1876 of a fever that went wrong faster than anyone understood. The baby had died with her, a boy. He did not say the baby's name, and she did not ask. I stayed another year, he said. He was looking at the stove. I thought staying was the right thing, that it was what she would have wanted, that the land meant something. He paused. Then I decided that I had been wrong about most of those things, and that staying was just the way I was hurting myself because I didn't know how to do anything else. So you rode away, Alma said. I rode away, he agreed. I sold the farm to my neighbor at less than it was worth because I wanted to be done with it quickly. I had a horse and money enough in no particular direction, and I just went. 1,000 miles of going nowhere in particular. He looked at her then, and she met his gaze and held it. I went through Nebraska and Wyoming and came south when the snow started. I didn't plan to stop here. I didn't plan anything. And yet here you are, she said. And yet here I am, he said, and the way he said it was different from how she might have expected, not quite resignation, not quite relief, but something in between that was still finding its shape. She told him about England. Not everything, not that first day, but the surface of it: Liverpool, the house, her parents, the letter from the schoolteachers' cooperative, the decision to come. He listened the way she had already begun to notice he listened, which was with his full attention and no urge to fill the spaces between her sentences with anything of his own. That was brave, he said. It was terrifying, she said honestly. I was sick for 4 of the 22 days, and I did not sleep properly for the last 3, and I arrived in New York City with $9 and a carpet bag, and the address of a rail terminus written on a piece of paper I was afraid to put down. And here you are, he said, returning her own words to her. And here I am, she agreed, and something about the symmetry of it made her smile, and the smile made him look at her with an expression she chose not to examine too closely because she was not ready for what it might mean. He left before dark and thanked her for the tea, and she walked back to Mrs. Ives's boarding house through the cold evening air, thinking that she had known this man for approximately 3 weeks and had spoken to him properly for less than an hour, and was already quite sure that he was important. This alarmed her, because she was a careful woman by nature and by necessity, and important things had a way of becoming things you could lose. November turned to December, and the snow came down for real, blanketing the valley below the mountains and turning Harlan Creek into something from a picture book: smoke rising from every chimney, the creek frozen at its edges, the horses wearing their winter coats. Alma kept the schoolhouse stove going with a wood supply that Clarence had quietly arranged with the Rafferty operations timber, which came by wagon every 2 weeks without her asking for it. She did ask him about it when she found out. You did not need to do that, she told him. I know, he said. The school committee was supposed to arrange it. They were taking their time. Mr. Abbott, she said, and he turned and looked at her with a patience that was not defensive and not apologetic and not anything except present, and she found she did not have anything to follow up his name with. Thank you, she said, which was not what she had started to say but was what she meant. The Christmas social at the church was the first time she saw him outside of the context of commerce and purpose, not buying gloves, not fixing a stove, not passing on the street with hats tipped and weather discussed. It was an evening of song and fellowship, and Mrs. Ives's extraordinary gingerbread, and the schoolhouse children performed a tableau of the Nativity, with a dedication that was undermined by the fact that the boy playing Joseph had recently lost a tooth and whistled slightly on his consonants. Clarence stood at the back of the room and watched with that particular attention of his, and when Alma joined him there after the performance, he handed her a cup of cider without a word, and they stood together watching the children receive their candy bags from Pastor Whitmore, and she thought, "This is the best thing that has happened in quite some time." They walked back up the street together afterward because their routes overlapped, and the snow was coming down in fat, slow flakes, and the town looked soft and unreal in the white dark, and she was almost at the boarding house when he stopped and said, "Miss Merriweather." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral and not quite achieving it. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if you are willing, properly." She looked at him for a long moment. The snow fell between them with the impartiality of weather. "I am willing," she said. She watched something shift behind his eyes, not the opening of a door but the unclenching of a hand that had been closed for a very long time. "Good," he said. "Then I will call on you Sunday if that suits." "It suits," she said. He tipped his hat and walked away through the snow, and she went inside and sat by the stove in her room for a long time, not reading the book open in her lap, thinking about the way he had said the word willing, as though it were a thing of considerable weight, and he had treated it accordingly. He called on her Sunday, and the Sunday after, and the Sunday after that. He took her walking along the creek when the weather allowed, and when it did not allow they sat in the parlor at Mrs. Ives's boarding house under the formidable and entirely contented supervision of Mrs. Ives herself, who brought them tea and biscuits, and then found things to do in the adjacent room with a thoroughness that provided both propriety and privacy in approximately equal measure. She learned him in the way you learn a landscape that rewards patience, not all at once, not from a distance, but by going deeper in, by following the small paths that branch off the obvious ones. She learned that he had taught himself to read at the age of 8 from a Bible and a seed catalog, which struck her as both practical and profound. She learned that he could name most of the stars visible from the Colorado Territory sky, having spent a great deal of time looking at them from the back of a horse in Nebraska and Wyoming and places between. She learned that he had a gentleness with animals that was habitual and unself-conscious, that he would stop and speak quietly to a distressed horse in the street, the way another man might stop to help a fallen stranger. She learned that the scar on his left hand was from a plowshare accident when he was 17, and that it had healed badly because his father had not thought it necessary to see a doctor for such things, and that his father had been a man of strong opinions and limited warmth who had nevertheless loved his son in the particular way of men of that generation and character, not with words or gestures, but with the fact of the land he had built and left behind. She told him things in return. About her mother's garden, which had been a patch of earth the size of a dinner table in a terraced house in Liverpool, but which had been tended with the seriousness of a proper estate, and which had produced tomatoes every August that were, her mother insisted, the best in England. About her father's bookshop, which was less a commercial enterprise than a personal library that occasionally sold things, and where she had spent her childhood between shelves that went to the ceiling, and had understood from the age of 7 that the world was very large and mostly made of words. She told him about the crossing, about the 19th day and the weeping and the gannet that dove like a knife. He listened to all of it, and when she finished he said, "What does a gannet look like?" And she laughed before she could stop herself, and the laugh surprised them both, and then he smiled, not the small beginning of a smile she had seen in the dry goods store, but a full one, unguarded, and she thought, "There it is." There is the man inside the grief. January was cold and March was still cold, and in between there was February, which was cold in a different key. But the schoolhouse was warm, and the children were learning, and Clarence came on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesday evenings as well. And Alma discovered that her new life, the one she had come across an ocean to find, was assembling itself around her in ways she had imagined, and in ways she had not. She had not imagined this particular man. She had not imagined the particular satisfaction of being understood by someone who expressed that understanding mostly through attention and the occasional precise remark, rather than through an abundance of words. She had not imagined how much she would come to trust someone she had known for so short a time, or how that trust would feel, not like a thing placed or decided, but like something that had simply grown in the way things grow in good conditions, without effort and without announcement. She had not imagined, if she was honest with herself in the way she tried to be in her better moments, that she would fall in love. But she was falling in love. She was quite clear-eyed about it, which was in character. She did not dress it up or explain it away or pretend it was something more manageable. She simply recognized it for what it was, a complete rearrangement of what mattered most, a new center of gravity, and then she sat with it for a while and decided what to do about it. She had come here for a life. He was becoming part of the life she was building. Those two facts were not in conflict. They were, in fact, the same fact seen from different angles. What she did not know, and what troubled her more than she let on, was whether he had gotten far enough from his grief to make room for something new. She had seen the ways he held himself back, not from her, exactly, but from the future tense of things. He spoke about tomorrow the way a man speaks who is not entirely certain tomorrow is his to plan for. She had crossed an ocean and ridden across half a continent, and she was not afraid of the future. She was afraid of wanting something, and finding that the person she wanted it with was not yet ready to want it back. The answer came in late March, when the first real thaw broke the back of winter, and the creek ran loud and fast with snowmelt, and the air smelled of mud and pine and something green and possible. They had walked further along the creek than usual, past the edge of the town, to a bend where the water slowed in a wide pool, and the cottonwood trees grew thick, their branches still bare but beginning to bud. She was telling him about the 3 older boys who had finally begun to read full chapters on their own, about the pride she felt in watching a child unlock the door of the written word, when she stopped because he had stopped. He was looking at her with that expression she had learned not to look away from, the one that costs something, and he said, "Alma." It was the first time he had used her first name without the miss in front of it, and the difference was small and enormous simultaneously. "Clarence," she said. "I have been trying to find the right words for something for about 3 months," he said, "and I have come to believe there may not be right words for it, which is a problem for a man who doesn't talk very much to begin with." "Tell me anyway," she said. He looked at the water for a moment, then back at her. "When I left Missouri, I was not looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. I was looking for the opposite of anything. I was looking for enough empty road that I could stop feeling like myself." He paused. What I did not expect to find was a woman reading an arithmetic problem to 34 children in a schoolhouse in the middle of Colorado who had come across an entire ocean on her own and was not, as far as I could see, afraid of a single thing in the world. "I am afraid of quite a few things," she said. "Not of the important ones," he said. "Not of beginning, not of caring." He took a breath. "I was afraid of both for a long time. I am less afraid than I was. I think that is because of you, and I think you deserve to know it." The cottonwood buds were very small and very determined. The creek ran past with great seriousness. She looked at him, this man who had ridden 1,000 miles to lose himself, and had somehow arrived at the same small town in the same small hour as the woman who had crossed a whole ocean to find herself. And she thought that the world, for all its cruelty and its distances, occasionally arranged things with a precision that felt, if not divine, then at least deeply intentional. "I have something to tell you as well," she said. I came here to build a life. I had a clear idea of what that meant: children and books and a warm schoolhouse and a room with an east-facing window. I did not have you in that idea. And now I find that you are in it, and the idea is considerably better for having you there, and I thought you should know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand very carefully, as though it were something that deserved to be held with full attention, and she let him. And his hand was warm and large and bore the old scar from the plowshare and the newer calluses from a winter of ranch work, and she held it back. "I love you," he said. Not tentatively, not with qualification. Just that plainly, in the voice of a man who had decided that the truth was the only reasonable option left. "I love you," she said. "I love you, and I have been quite aware of it for approximately 2 months and have been trying to determine the correct moment to mention it." He made that sound that she had first heard in the boarding-house parlor on a Sunday afternoon in January. The low, reluctant laugh that sounded like a man remembering he knew how. And it was, she decided then and there, the best sound she had ever heard. He kissed her beside the creek, with the cottonwoods beginning to bud above them, and the snowmelt water running fast and cold below. And she kissed him back with the conviction of a woman who has crossed an ocean and does not do things halfway. Spring came in earnest after that, in the extravagant way of Colorado springs, sudden and overwhelming. Wildflowers detonating across the valley floor in colors so certain of themselves they seemed aggressive. The schoolchildren arrived each morning with mud on their boots and minds full of the outdoor world, and Alma managed the dual challenge of keeping them at their books while letting the spring in the windows do some of its own teaching. Clarence came by the school on a Wednesday afternoon in April. He had something in his hands, a small packet wrapped in cloth, and he stood at the door with the same posture he always had, hat in hand, patient, not crowding anything. She came to the door and he handed her the packet, and inside was a book of pressed wildflowers that someone had made, each one labeled in a careful hand with its common name and a smaller script beneath that she recognized after a moment as Latin. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Denver," he said. "I went up to Denver last week for Rafferty, taking some stock. I found it in a bookshop there." He paused. "It seemed like the kind of thing you would like." She looked at the dried flowers between the pages: columbine, lupin, yellow coneflower, all things she had already begun to notice in the fields around the creek. "It is exactly the kind of thing I would like," she said. "How did you know?" He gave her a look that said he had been paying attention. She laughed and put the book against her chest the way she had held that salt-soaked letter on the stern of the Elspeth, except that the feeling now was entirely different, and she thought, yes, this is what the new world was for. He proposed in May, on a Sunday, in the church parlor after the service because it was raining outside and the creek path was impassable with mud, which was not the setting he had had in mind, but which suited them both perfectly well given that they were the sort of people for whom the important things happened in ordinary rooms. He had a ring. He had written to his neighbor in Missouri, the man who had bought the farm, asking that a particular thing from the farmhouse be sent west, and it had come on the freight wagon 3 weeks prior. A small ring that had been his mother's, a gold band with a single garnet, not grand by any measure but real and old and worn by a woman who had been loved. He held it out to her and said, "Alma, will you marry me?" It was slightly more declaration than question, which she would tease him about later and often, and she said yes before he had fully finished saying her name. Pastor Whitmore performed the ceremony in June. The schoolchildren attended, along with most of Harlan Creek, because a wedding in a small town is a thing the whole town attends, and because Alma had made herself liked in the months since her arrival with the same matter-of-fact warmth that she brought to everything. Mrs. Ives cried, which she would have denied if pressed. Orrin, the stagecoach driver, sat in the back row and chewed tobacco outside the door, and came in to shake Clarence's hand afterward with the air of a man who had witnessed the beginning of this particular story, and felt some proprietary satisfaction in the ending. They moved into a small house at the edge of town that Clarence had arranged with Rafferty, a two-room structure that had been a foreman's quarters and was now theirs, with a kitchen and a stove and a window that faced the mountains, which Alma declared superior even to her east-facing boarding house window because the mountains were present in all weather and at all hours and had the quality of permanent things, which was what she needed. The summer of 1878 was the summer of their beginning. She kept the school. He kept his work at the Rafferty spread but began, on the side, the slow work of establishing a small claim of land along the creek, not large, not ambitious, but a piece of ground that was theirs, that could become something over time. She helped him plan it in the evenings at the kitchen table, both of them bent over a rough map he drew, arguing in the entirely pleasant way of two people who are very different in certain respects and know how to be. She had been in Harlan Creek barely a year, but it had become hers in the way that places become yours, not because you were born there or stayed there forever, but because you chose them and they received you and something took root. She wrote home. There was no one left in Liverpool who was really hers, but she wrote to her mother's sister in Manchester, a woman named Edith who had disapproved of the American plan and said so in 3 successive letters, and was now, Alma hoped, ready to hear that the plan had worked, that the ocean had been worth crossing and the prairie had been worth enduring, and that she had found, in a schoolhouse at the end of a dirt path in Colorado territory, not only a vocation but a life so full and various that she barely recognized herself as the woman who had stood at the stern of a ship and wept. Aunt Edith wrote back. The letter said, "I never thought you were wrong, only frightened for you. I am very glad. Tell me about him." The autumn brought the harvest, and with the harvest came a particular kind of satisfaction that Alma had not known before, the satisfaction of things that are seasonal and certain, that come around because they are supposed to, that make the place feel anchored in time. She and Clarence dug potatoes from the kitchen garden she had planted in June, and she made a soup that he ate 2 bowls of, and said was the best thing he had eaten since his mother's cooking, which she accepted as the highest compliment available. She learned to ride properly in the autumn. She had managed a horse before, in the vague way of a woman who had occasionally ridden out of necessity, but Clarence taught her in the calm, methodical way he taught most things, with patience and without condescension, starting with the basics and building up, explaining the animal's logic before asking her to trust it. She was a quick student, to neither of their surprise, and by October she could manage the Rafferty quarter horse they borrowed on weekends well enough to ride out to the further edges of the land claim and back. Those rides were the times she loved best, those early autumn mornings with the aspens turning gold on the hillsides and the air sharp and clean and Clarence riding beside her, pointing out things, a hawk above the ridge, a track in the mud beside the creek that he identified as an elk's, the exact line where one rancher's land ended and the open range began. He had become, over the months, not just a man she loved but a companion she delighted in, and the delight surprised her in its freshness. She had expected love to become comfortable, and it had, but it had also remained interesting, which she had not counted on. "Tell me something you have not told me," she said one morning as they walked the horses along the creek. He thought about it for a while. That was another thing she loved about him. He did not answer quickly. "When I was 12, he said, "I found a fox kid in the brush along the fence line. Its mother was dead. I kept it in the barn for 6 weeks and fed it scraps until it could fend for itself, and then it went off into the woods and I never saw it again, and I was very sad about it but also very glad because it was supposed to go." She looked at him. "That is a complete story," she said. "That is a perfect little story." "It is just something that happened," he said, but he was looking pleased in the careful way he had. "Your turn," he said, she thought. "When I was 16, I memorized the entirety of a very long poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson because I was trying to impress a boy who turned out not to be worth impressing. But I still know the poem, and I still find it beautiful, and I decided recently that the poem was the real point of the exercise and the boy was just the excuse." He laughed. The real laugh, the one she had been collecting since March. They were building something. That was the only way she could describe it to herself. Not just the house and the land claim and the school and the garden, but something structural and invisible that had the character of all the things they were making together. It was the life she had come to find, and it was the life he had ridden until he had found it too, and it fit them both in the way that things fit when they are made right, not without effort, not without adjustment, but with the sense that the effort and the adjustment were the point, were the material from which the actual thing was constructed. In December of 1878, exactly 1 year after she had stood in the street of Harlan Creek with her trunk and her carpet bag and her New World uncertainty, Alma discovered she was carrying a child. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning before church, because she could not wait until after, and could not imagine telling him anywhere other than in their own kitchen in their own house, with the mountains in the window and the stove going. She simply told him plainly, which was how she told him everything, and watched his face. What happened to his face in the seconds after she told him was the most complicated and luminous thing she had ever seen. First there was a kind of stillness, the breath held kind. Then something large and old moved through his expression, the ghost of the grief, the fact of what he had lost, the boy who had not lived, and she watched him feel it and not let it stop him, watched him walk through it toward the other side, where what she had just told him was simply true and joyful and forward-pointing. And then the smile, the full, unguarded one, the one that had cost something the first time and cost less now but was worth more because she knew what it had come from. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands and said, "Alma," just her name. Then, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am a very practical woman and I intend to be perfectly well throughout, and I am telling you this clearly now so that you will not worry in a way that is disproportionate to the circumstances." "I will worry," he said. "I will worry at exactly the level the circumstances warrant." "Which is moderate," she said. "Which is moderate," he agreed and kissed her, and held on for a moment longer than the kiss, his arms around her and his face against her hair, and she felt his breath slow and steady and thought, "This is the man who rode 1,000 miles to lose himself. Look how found he is." She continued teaching through the winter and into the spring, which raised certain eyebrows among the more conservative members of the school committee, and she addressed the raised eyebrows with the same pleasant forthrightness she brought to other obstacles, explaining that the children required continuity, and that she was not ill, and that she would arrange for temporary instruction in the final weeks before her confinement. The committee, faced with the practical reality that she was the best teacher they had ever had and would be difficult to replace, agreed. The spring was again extravagant with wildflowers. Clarence had been working the land claim with a focus that had taken on a particular urgency. He wanted the well finished, the fence extended, a second room begun on the house before the baby came. He worked with methodical industry, and she helped when she could and watched from the kitchen window when she could not, and she thought often about the farm in Missouri and the man who had left it and what it had cost him to invest again in ground and future. She asked him about it one evening. "Does it frighten you?" she asked, "wanting things again, building them, knowing they can be lost?" He was quiet for a while. The lamp burned between them on the table. "Yes," he said, "some mornings. But then you say something, or I see you in the schoolhouse through the window when I am passing, or you laugh at something that is not particularly funny and laugh anyway, and the fear—" He paused. "It does not go away entirely, but it goes small, small enough to work around. That is probably the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she told him. "I decided some time ago that honesty was the only thing I was reliably good at," he said. "I thought I should lean into it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while, the mountains dark outside the window and the creek audible in the distance, and the spring night coming in through the cracked window with its smell of mud and new growth. The baby was born in August of 1879. A boy. They named him William, after no one in particular, and for no reason except that it was a good solid name and felt right when they said it together. He arrived in the early morning with the assistance of the doctor, a Scotsman named Campbell who was brisk and competent, and did not attempt to be sentimental about it until after, when he shook Clarence's hand in the hallway with a warmth that was entirely genuine. Clarence held the boy in both arms with the practiced uncertainty of a man who has not done this before and is terrified of doing it wrong, and the baby regarded him from the incomprehensible distance of new life with dark, unfocused eyes. And Clarence said, very quietly, so that only Alma could hear from the bed, "Hello." She did not need to ask what he was feeling. She could see it plainly, all of it, the grief and the love and the future tense, and the fact of the boy, and the fact of the boy before this boy, who was never going to see anything at all. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her, and there was nothing to say, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and that was entirely correct. William was a solid, opinionated baby who slept badly and ate enthusiastically, and regarded the world with an expression that Alma recognized as approximately her own. He was held frequently by the children at the schoolhouse, who took turns when she brought him by in the afternoons, and who treated him with the particular reverence that children reserve for things that are simultaneously extremely small and extremely important. Life in Harlan Creek had its textures and its complications. There were good years and years that were harder. A dry summer in 1880 that cut the grass short and worried the ranchers, including Bill Rafferty, who was not a man given to visible worry and whose visible worry was therefore alarming. There was a summer fever that went through the town in 1881 and took old Mr. Prescott from the dry goods store and a child of 2 from the Hernandez family, and Alma sat with Maria Hernandez through the worst night of her grief, the way she had once held the hand of a woman on a ship, because some things did not change across oceans or years. There was a dispute in 1882 about water rights along the creek, which involved Rafferty and the new ranch operation that had come in from the north, owned by a man named Hollies, who had money and less patience than money typically required. The dispute went to the county court and was handled legally and methodically, which was the best possible outcome, and the one Clarence had insisted upon from the start, working with a lawyer from Pueblo who came down twice and earned his fee. Clarence's land claim became, over those years, a small but proper operation, a good well, a barn, 10 head of cattle, a vegetable garden that Alma managed with the same serious intent her mother had brought to the patch of earth in Liverpool, though in Colorado the tomatoes were, objectively, better. He had stopped working for Rafferty by 1881, having accumulated enough to stand on his own ground without the supplemental wage, and the independence of it suited him in a way that was visible in his bearing, in the way he moved through his days with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has built the thing he is standing on. In 1882, Alma delivered a second child, a girl. They named her Frances, and she arrived with red hair, which neither of her parents could account for and which Mrs. Ives, still going strong at 64, still serving breakfast and commentary with equal generosity, declared was a sign of excellent character. "Red hair means she knows what she wants, Mrs. Ives said with conviction. Then she and her mother should get along brilliantly, Clarence said, and received Alma's best level look, which was a look he had learned to find more endearing than intimidating. Frances was everything William was not: a good sleeper, a quiet observer, a child who sat very still and watched the world with those startling blue eyes before deciding whether it warranted her participation. She and William, 18 months apart, achieved between them the kind of sibling dynamic that was competitive in small ways and deeply loyal in the ways that counted, And by the time Frances was old enough to follow William around the yard, she did so with the determination of someone who has decided that where her brother goes, she will also go. The schoolhouse was expanded in 1883. Alma had been lobbying the school committee for 2 years, and the combination of population growth in the valley, new families arriving, the mine north of town producing well, and her particular persistence in the lobbying had finally produced both the funding and the timber. A second room was added and a second teacher was hired, a young woman from Kansas named Dorothy, who was 22 and earnest and a quick study, and whom Alma took in hand with the same matter-of-fact energy she brought to difficult students. "You will get the older children," Alma told her, on Dorothy's first day. "They are testing you already. You can see it in the way young Thomas Briggs is sitting. He is going to give you trouble for approximately 2 weeks, and then he is going to read better than anyone in the room and feel proud about it. Let him arrive at the pride himself." Dorothy looked at Thomas Briggs, who was indeed sitting in the unmistakable posture of a boy preparing mischief, and then looked back at Alma. "How do you know all of this?" "I have been doing this for 5 years," Alma said. "Watch, and you will know it too." Dorothy was a good teacher, and in time a good friend, and the school prospered under both of them. By 1884, there were 51 children enrolled, which meant a third teacher was required. But that was a problem for the future, and the future was not frightening. Nothing was as frightening as it had once been. This was something Alma noticed on an ordinary Thursday morning in the spring of 1884, standing in the schoolhouse doorway watching the children cross the yard to begin the day, the mountains bright and enormous behind them and the creek audible in the near distance, and the grass coming green in the fields. She was 30 years old. She had been in Colorado territory for 6 years. She had crossed an ocean and found a new life, and it had turned out to be full and wide and complicated and joyful in the specific, unromanticized way of things that are actually lived. She thought about the woman who had stood at the stern of the Elspeth with a salt-soaked letter and an uncertain future, and felt for her a kind of tender respect, as you feel for a person who did something difficult and did it right. Clarence found her in the schoolhouse doorway at noon, when he came by with the lunch she had forgotten on the kitchen table. He looked at her expression, which was the thoughtful, complete one she wore when something had resolved inside her, and he said, "What?" "I was just thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that I am very happy," she said. "I thought I should tell you since you are responsible for a significant portion of it." He handed her the lunch pail and looked at her in the way she still could not quite anticipate, even after 6 years, the way that moved behind his eyes with a warmth that was not demonstrative but was enormous. "A significant portion," he said. "A very significant portion," she said. "Good," he said, and kissed her on the cheek, and went back to his horse, and she watched him go and then went back into the schoolhouse with her lunch pail and her full and unreserved happiness. The summer of 1884 was when the gold scare came. There had been rumors for 2 years of gold in the creek bed north of Harlan Creek, rumors that Alma had dismissed as the kind of thing people invented in places where winters were long, and the difference between enough and not enough was always visible. But in the summer of 1884, the rumors became reports, and the reports brought men, and the men brought the particular disruption that was the shadow side of the Western promise. Not lawlessness exactly, but a loosening of the ordinary rules, an influx of strangers with interests at odds with the people already there. 3 of Rafferty's cattle were shot in June, which Rafferty attributed to a new camp that had established itself on the creek 2 miles north. There was a confrontation at the saloon in July that resulted in a broken window and a deputy with a split lip. The school enrollment dropped slightly as 2 families pulled up and moved further south, and Alma watched their children on the last day with the particular sadness of an investment interrupted. She spoke to Clarence about it. "Is it going to get worse?" she asked. He considered. "It will get harder before it gets better," he said. "Gold does that, but Harlan Creek is not a wide-open town. It has roots now." People who are serious about the place, that makes a difference. You are one of those people, she said. So are you, he said, more than most. He was right that it got harder before it improved. In August, there was a genuine crisis. A group of men from the northern camp came into town looking for a man they claimed owed them money, and the search became aggressive and frightened people. And the sheriff, a steady man named Dahlan who had held the job since 1876, managed the situation with the particular combination of calm and firmness that was his considerable gift. Nobody was seriously hurt. The man they were looking for turned out not to be in Harlan Creek, and the group left, and the incident left behind the usual residue of shaken nerves and sharper awareness. Alma had sent William and Francis to Mrs. Ives's house for the afternoon when the trouble started, which was the right thing to do, and she had stayed at the schoolhouse because there were 3 children whose parents had not collected them yet, and she was not leaving them alone. Clarence came to the schoolhouse directly when he heard what was happening, arriving on horseback at a canter, with the specific face of a man who has calculated the fastest route from where he is to where she is. "Children are safe," she said before he could ask. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said. "The children are calm because I am calm, and the trouble is 2 streets over and Mr. Dahlan has it in hand." He stood in the doorway with the early evening light behind him and looked at her in the way he had that first time in the dry goods store, as though he had braced for something and found it milder than expected, except that 6 years on the thing he had braced for was her, and what he found was not milder. It was simply her, entirely herself, and that was what he had come to find. He came into the schoolhouse and sat with the 3 remaining children while she made them feel safe, which she did in approximately 10 minutes through the simple expedient of reading them, a story about a very small bear who lived in a very large wood and was afraid of nothing at all. And when their parents came for them, one by one, each child left with the story in their heads instead of the trouble. When the last child was gone and the door was closed, he sat with her in the empty schoolhouse in the late light, and they were quiet together the way they were sometimes quiet, which was not the absence of something but the presence of it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Where else would I be?" he said. Not a question, a statement of direction. "This is where I am oriented. This is my north." She reached for his hand on the bench between them and held it, and the creek ran outside and the mountains held the last of the light, and Harlan Creek settled back into its ordinary rhythms around them. The gold scare faded over the following year as most of the men at the northern camp moved on when the creek yielded less than promised, which was what creeks almost always did when gold was in question and hope was the main currency. The town breathed again, the enrollment climbed back up, and by the spring of 1885, the worst of it felt like a story that had happened to someone else's town. Alma had another letter from Aunt Edith in the spring of 1885. Edith was not well. She was in her late 60s and had a chest condition that had been worsening, and the letter was the kind of letter that people write when they are settling accounts with the world. She told Alma she was proud of her, which she had never said before, or if she had, Alma did not remember it. She said the thing about the American plan had been fear and not disapproval, as Alma had rightly suspected. She said she would like to see a picture of William and Francis if one could be managed. Alma arranged for a photograph at the studio in Pueblo on a trip she and Clarence made in June. It was a serious undertaking. William was 5, and Francis was 3, and both of them were deeply uncertain about sitting still for the required duration, and the resulting photograph had a quality of suppressed wildness that she felt accurately represented both children. She sent it to Manchester with a long letter that described everything: the house and the mountains and the school and the children and Clarence, and the way a Colorado morning looks when the light comes off the peaks in June. Edith wrote back in August. She said the photograph was the finest thing she owned. She died in October of 1885, which was a sadness but not a surprise, and Alma grieved her properly and then kept her as one keeps those who are gone. In the ordinary act of living the life they were glad to see you living. The schoolhouse had, by 1886, grown into something Alma was quietly and profoundly proud of. 58 children enrolled, 2 additional teachers, a small library of 37 books that she had accumulated through a combination of her own purchases, donations from families, and a campaign she had run with the town council that had produced a modest but real endowment. She had taught some of those children to read from pure scratch, and those children were now teaching their younger siblings at home in the evenings, and the literacy was compounding like interest, spreading from the schoolhouse outward into the valley's households, and she thought sometimes that this diffusion of letters and words and the opening of worlds through reading was the truest version of the thing she had come to do. In 1887, they added a second room to the house. Clarence did most of the work himself, with the help of a man named Aurelio Vasquez, who had come to Harlan Creek from New Mexico Territory, and had a gift for construction that Clarence recognized and respected. Aurelio had arrived as one of the nameless many who passed through western towns, and had stayed, as people sometimes did, because staying had offered something better than the continuing. He and Clarence worked well together in the uncomplicated way of 2 practical men who communicate mostly through the work. The new room was for Alma's books and her desk, a room of her own within the house, which Clarence had suggested unprompted, and which she had received with the fullness of feeling that comes when someone knows you well enough to give you exactly the thing you need before you have thought to ask for it. She arranged the books with great deliberation and stood in the finished room on the evening Clarence declared it done, looking at the shelves and the desk and the window that faced the creek, and she felt the full, clean satisfaction of a woman who has built something real. "Well," he asked from the doorway. "It is exactly right," she said. "Good," he said. "You have been without a proper study for 9 years, and I should have done it sooner." "You have been somewhat busy," she said, thinking of everything, the land, the cattle, the children, the town, the life they had been assembling in the slow and steady way of things built to last. She crossed the room to where he stood and kissed him in the straightforward, unambiguous way she had been kissing him for 9 years, which was the way of a woman who means what she does. He held her with the same deliberate care with which he had first taken her hand by the creek in March of 1878, because it was a habit with him treating the good things carefully, giving them the attention they deserved. William turned 10 in 1889, and was, by this point, reading at a level that frankly surpassed most of the older children in the school, which his mother took entirely in stride, and his father accepted with the particular pride of a man who had taught himself from a Bible and a seed catalog, and recognized the same hunger in his son. William wanted to know everything about everything, with the specific urgency of a very young person who has just discovered that the world is enormous, and he asked questions at a rate that Alma addressed fully and Clarence addressed thoughtfully, and both of them found completely wonderful. Frances was 8 and had developed into exactly the person Mrs. Ives had predicted, a girl of very clear opinions who knew what she wanted and was not confused about how to communicate it. She was fierce in her loyalties and slow to anger but implacable when moved to it, and she had her father's quality of full attention when she listened, so that you felt, when Frances looked at you, entirely regarded. She had decided at age 6 that she was going to be a doctor, which Alma told her was an excellent thing to be, and which Clarence said he thought she would accomplish with approximately the difficulty of a walk across a large room. The year 1889 was also the year Colorado became a proper state. Well, Colorado had been a state since 1876, but 1889 was the year Harlan Creek felt the changes most acutely. The year the population was large enough to press for a proper courthouse, and the telegraph line finally reached from Pueblo all the way through the valley, which meant the news arrived the same day it happened, and the world felt at once larger and smaller. Alma stood at the telegraph office the day the first message came through for Harlan Creek and watched the operator receive it, and thought about the ship and the ocean and the journey, and about the fact that the world she had arrived in 10 years ago was not the world she inhabited now, not in its external facts and not in its internal ones. It was larger than she had imagined and more complicated than she had hoped and more beautiful than she had deserved, and she had, in it, found the life she crossed the ocean to find, and discovered it contained things she had never thought to include in the finding. A man who had ridden 1,000 miles to lose himself. A boy who asked why the stars were where they were. A girl who was going to be a doctor. A schoolhouse full of children learning to read. A room of her own with her books and her desk. A kitchen that smelled in the mornings of coffee and bread. Mountains that held the light. She walked home from the telegraph office through the October afternoon. The aspens turned gold on the hillsides and the creek running clear over the stones. And Clarence was coming from the other direction along the street, having been at the land claim since morning, and they met in the middle of the street in the ordinary way of two people who are going to the same place and have simply approached it from different sides. He looked at her and she at him, and both of them had been outside all morning and were carrying the particular quality of people who have been useful in the world. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. They walked home together. The house was warm when they came in. Frances was at the table doing her arithmetic. William was lying on the floor with a book about stars and reading with the concentration of a person to whom reading had become necessary air. The stove was going. The mountains were in the window. Alma put her shawl on the hook by the door. Clarence hung his hat beside it, the two hooks side by side. He had put them both there 9 years ago when they first moved in, without ceremony, just as a practical thing, and she had noticed it then and never said anything but had thought, "Yes, that is it. That is exactly it." She went to the stove and checked the pot. He came and stood beside her and looked over her shoulder and said the soup smelled good. She said it would be ready in 20 minutes, and he said that was exactly as long as it took to wash up. She said that was fortunate. He kissed the top of her head, and she let him, and the children did not look up from their respective books, having grown entirely accustomed to their parents' particular brand of quiet, unremarkable, completely genuine devotion. They ate together at the kitchen table with the mountains in the last of the evening light, and William asked if it was true that some of the stars they could see had already died, and they were only seeing the old light, and Clarence said yes. He had read something to that effect, and Frances said that seemed very sad and also very interesting. Alma said that a great many things were both sad and interesting simultaneously, and that this was one of the qualities that made paying attention to the world worthwhile. William wanted to know more about the dead stars. Clarence knew more. The dinner got cold while he explained what he knew, which was more than most men knew because he had spent a long time looking at the sky from the back of a horse in Nebraska, and Frances interrupted frequently with clarifying questions, and Alma ate her soup and watched them and felt the fullness of the thing around the table, the warm, actual, present, real fullness of it. Afterward, when the children were in bed and the dishes were done and the lamp was burning low on the table, she sat across from Clarence in the kitchen and told him what she had been thinking about for most of the day. "I was thinking about the crossing," she said, "about the decision to come, about whether it was brave or just desperate or whether those two things are the same." "What conclusion did you reach?" he asked. "That they are the same," she said, "and that it doesn't matter. What matters is the arriving." "The arriving," he repeated. "Yes," she said, "you arrived too, we just came from different directions." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, this man who had been made and unmade and made again by loss and distance, and the long, difficult work of returning to himself. And she could see in him, easily now, the way you see things clearly in places you know well, the 24-year-old who had married Sarah in Missouri and built a life on Eastern ground, and the 30-year-old who had sold that life for less than it was worth and ridden away. and the man who had arrived in Harlan Creek on a red clay horse in October of 1878 and reached for the tin of tobacco on the adjacent shelf, and the man who had held their boy in both arms and said hello, and the man who had built her a room of her own because he knew her well enough to know she needed it. All of those men were the same man, and they were all here in this kitchen in this life. "We found both," she said. It was not a proclamation. It was just the truth plainly stated. "We found both," he said. Outside, the creek ran on. The mountains stood in the dark. The aspens had finished turning gold for the year and would be bare for the winter and gold again next autumn. Reliable as anything reliable gets, which is to say not perfectly but mostly, and mostly was more than enough. In the years that followed, Harlan Creek grew, and the schoolhouse grew, and the children who had learned to read in Alma's care grew up, and some of them stayed and built their own lives along the creek and in the valley, and some of them went elsewhere, to Denver and further, but carried with them the particular habit of mind that a good teacher instills. The belief that the world is legible if you look at it carefully, that words are tools and also gifts, that learning is not a thing that stops. William went to a school in Denver at 15 to study science, which was a considerable undertaking, and cost them more than was comfortable but less than they had feared. And he wrote home every 2 weeks with the diligence of a boy who understood that he was loved, and owed the people who loved him a faithful accounting of his existence. Frances at 14 was apprenticed to a doctor, the same Dr. Campbell who had delivered her, who had decided that her interest and her aptitude were both serious enough to take seriously, which in that time and place was a remarkable thing, and required the combined advocacy of Alma and Clarence and Mrs. Ives and several members of the town council, and the particular, implacable will of Frances herself. Mrs. Ives lived to be 78 and died in 1896 in her own bed, with the satisfaction of a woman who had arranged her life exactly as she wanted it, and had no complaints with the outcome. She left Alma a small sum of money and a box of letters, which turned out to be correspondence going back 40 years, her life in full, in her own hand, and which Alma kept with the same care she kept the pressed wildflower book and the garnet ring, now worn so smooth and comfortable on her finger that she sometimes forgot it was there, which was, she had decided, the goal of all good things. Clarence turned 50 in 1898, and the land claim had become a proper small ranch by then, not large, not wealthy, but real and his and well built, everything on it constructed to last. He had the good quality of weathering. He had become, in the way of men who work outdoors and work hard, exactly himself, the essential character of him clarified by years of use. His hair had silver in it, and his hands were harder, and he moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned not to waste motion. But the eyes were the same creek water over brown stones, shifting, neither one thing nor the other, and entirely present when they looked at her. He turned 50 and she was 44, and they stood in the kitchen on the morning of his birthday while the children grown and gone to their own lives were absent, and she made him a cake with the good flour she had ordered from Pueblo, and he said it was too much trouble, and she said it was nothing of the kind. They ate the cake at the kitchen table where they had eaten 1,000 meals, and outside the mountains were in their October best, the aspens gold, and the sky that specific Colorado blue that she had come to think of as hers, the blue that was not English sky and was not Liverpool gray, and was entirely the color of this life in this place. She had not thought on the stern of the Elspeth that she would be sitting at this table on this morning. She had thought of a schoolhouse and a room and a modest, purposeful life. She had not thought of the gravity of a particular man, or of the way 1,000 miles of loss and 1,000 miles of hope could converge in the same dirt street. But here they were. "Happy birthday," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Tell me something you have not told me," she said, which was the game they had been playing for 20 years. He thought about it in the way he always did, with full, unhurried attention. "When I was riding through Nebraska," he said, "the second week I stopped at a farm and asked for water, and the woman who came to the door gave me water and a piece of cornbread and asked where I was going. I told her I didn't know, and she said that was fine, that most good things happen to people who were not particularly trying to find them." Alma looked at him. "You never told me that." "I was saving it," he said. She laughed. "The real one," he smiled, "the full one." Outside, the aspens were gold as anything. The creek ran on. William was in Denver studying the stars. Francis was in Pueblo apprenticed to a doctor who had been wise enough to recognize that the red-haired girl from Harlan Creek was going to save someone's life one day, and who was right about that. Mrs. Ives's boarding house had a new owner who kept the gingerbread recipe. Aurelio Vasquez had built a house of his own along the South Road. Dorothy from Kansas had married a rancher and had 3 children, and still taught the older classes with the same earnest thoroughness that Alma had helped her find. The mountains held everything in their ordinary, enormous way. The creek ran. The light came off the peaks in the morning and went long and gold in the afternoon, and the stars came out over the valley the way they always had, some of them still burning, some of them dead, all of them visible from this small, specific place on the turning earth. Clarence poured more coffee. She offered him the last of the cake. He accepted it. She folded her hands around her cup and watched the morning light move through the window and felt, with the full clarity of a woman who has never been afraid to look at things directly, the complete and settled rightness of where she was. She had crossed an ocean to find a new life. He had ridden 1,000 miles to lose his. In a small town at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, in the territory of Colorado, in the year of 1878 and all the years that followed, they had found both. They had found both.